In Dostoevsky's novel, The Brothers Karamazov, there's the story of Alyosha. And Alyosha returns late one night to the monastery. Father Pacy is reading as one would do, reading aloud from the gospel. A novice was sitting nearby, a young priest. It was late in the evening, and Alyosha sat down in Father Pacy's chamber there with the other two and began to listen. Father Pacy read, "And on the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee." Alyosha's mind raced over the events of the past days and weeks. And he was so tired, but he prayed as he listened, heard the words of the gospel, and lifted up his own prayers to God, and drifted ever closer to sleep. As Father Pacy continued reading, Alyosha slipped into a deep sleep. And just like when we fall asleep, he really wasn't aware of going to sleep, but suddenly the room, the little chamber where they stood, or where he was, began to open up, and he was in a large room, and he could hear the noise of a party, of a feast. He had slept into the passage he was hearing out loud. He could see the table where the guests of honor were sitting. He could smell the food and listen to the sounds of the festivities. Then he saw someone familiar, a frail older man, sitting at the high table, but he got up and began to walk over to where he was as sort of a wallflower watching this go on. It was Father Zosima. Spoiler alert, in the novel, The Brothers Karamazov, Zosima's dead at this point. Some of you were way ahead of me on that one. But Alyosha sees him clearly there at the wedding at Cana. And he comes over to Alyosha. He's so full of joy and laughing softly. And he says, "Yes, my dear, I am called too. Called and bidden. Why did you hide yourself over here out of sight? Come and join the party. Join in. We are drinking new wine." Alyosha was frightened, and in a whisper he confessed to Father Zosima, "I'm afraid." Zosima spoke, "Do you fear God? The Lord is terrible in divine greatness, awful in holy sublimity, but infinitely merciful. God has become like us from love and rejoices with us." I don't know about you, but for me, great novels can shift my perspective, make me see things in a new way. And Dostoevsky puts these opposing words next to one another, terrible and great, awful and sublime. And stories like The Brothers K can challenge us and help us see things in a new way. And here we have the wedding at Cana of Galilee as a participatory event, a transformational moment. Before Dostoevsky's retelling, I never really considered going to that wedding. Been to other weddings. I've been to many weddings. I've officiated. I've had the best seat in the house at weddings. But I never really imagined myself there. Studying Jesus' miracle at the wedding of Cana is crammed with these teasing little problems. Why was Jesus even there? Why was his mother there? Why were the disciples there? Later on in John, in chapter 21, we learn that Nathanael is from Cana. Was that the connection? But no matter what we do with this passage, it's tempting to focus on the miracle. The water into wine. It's tempting to focus on the place. What were they doing there? It's tempting to focus on the meta-narrative of the Gospel of John. How does this fit in with what John was trying to do? But the wedding, like all things, like all weddings, this wedding starts something new. For humanity, this is the good news of Jesus' ministry. And with this wedding, even more so than the beauty of the prologue of John in chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. This is the start of that potential for redemption for all of humankind. Rudolf Bultmann, great New Testament scholar, so great in fact that New Testament scholars who study the Gospel of John mark the period before Bultmann and after Bultmann. I remember when I first read that many years ago, and I thought, who's that guy? I want to know who that guy is, who he's made such an impact in scholarship that everybody since then has said we can only talk about John in relation to before and after Bultmann. But Bultmann, who was always trying to demythologize, which means just what it sounds like, he wanted to demythologize everything, warns against reading too much into the miracle. And he cites a familiar voice, one that we've heard on a couple of recent Sundays. Jesus' action, he says, was, in C.S. Lewis's terminology, a miracle of the old creation. The Creator who, year by year, turns water into wine by a natural process. On this occasion, speeds up the process and attains the same end. But if it's a miracle of the old creation, it's a parable of the new creation. Bultmann's saying this is a story of redeemed humanity. This is a story that we tell after the resurrection. We tell it after the events of the gospel. We don't tell it in real time. John Dominic Crossan takes Bultmann's reading and goes further. Crossan focuses on the miracle as a spiritual symbol. He says John interprets all of the physical or restorative miracles of Jesus as symbolic of what God is in Jesus, rather than of what God does in Jesus. And then he adds the question that I think is fantastic. Do you really think this was about wine? Is that what this story is about? Is this about the wine? It's not. It's about God's love for humanity. It's about God's love for you, for me, for all of us. Following this narrative flow in John 2, we see that when they run out of wine, Jesus' mother tells him about it. And his response is part of why this passage is so full, but he says, what's that have to do with me? And then he adds, my hour isn't come. My time isn't come. He's not being rude. He's sort of pulling back from the situation. I mentioned this before when I've talked about this passage. But in John, the word we translate in English as hour in Greek is ora, means that just time is passing. My time isn't yet. What he does in his ministry connects with his glorification, and his mother's concerns have to fit in with that context. So this is the story unfolding as we look at it. Jesus is free from human control. Not even his mother has a privileged claim on his action. His life is governed by God, not the people saying, hey, we're ready for you to do something. And that's another point in this that is relevant for us today. It's not just God's love, it's God's time. Again and again, we have this temptation to turn the wine back into water. We want to make sense of the situation, what really happened. We want to understand it. Both Bultmann and Crossan were trying to explain the miracle. That's really where they started. Instead, maybe we should take a note from Dostoevsky. In his story, Alyosha responds to the wedding by throwing himself on the ground. When he wakes up, he throws himself down and hugs the earth. I love this world, he says, having been in the presence of Christ and the risen mentor friend, Zosima. Tears form in his eyes and begin to drip and water the earth. These weren't sentimental tears. They were the tears of recognition that God's doing something. God's already at work. God is in the business of redemption. No matter what season you encounter, where you are, No matter if you're in a new season, a season of change, a season of setback, a season of failure, or some other kind of season, God's there. God's at work. This is a statement of both faith and recognition. Faith that God loves you. God is in this world. God is present. God is doing something. And recognition that all of human history is a testimony of God's work. That there are countless examples of that love, of that presence, of that amazing transforming power. Miracles, walking on water, feeding a whole bunch of people with just a little bit, healing. Oh, one of my favorites, calling Lazarus from the tomb. Sure, but those aren't the central point. None of them are the central point, not even turning water into wine. Jesus' earthly ministry is about to start in the Gospel of John, and each of these miracles is a vehicle for Jesus' holy presence. The scene suggests that life wasn't working out. I mean, they're at a big party. This is the party Jesus. That was a great question Will presented the children with. Do we think of Jesus as fun or serious? Fun or serious? And we all get so somber in church. We lean into the serious part of Jesus. But this is Jesus at a party. And things are about to go off the rails. They've run out of wine. We don't need to trip over the miracle or try to turn the wine back into water by trying to explain it or make sense of it. When life goes in an unexpected direction, we don't get to see everything God is doing. We can't pull back the veil of the world and see what is happening. The stone jars were full and ready for a purification ritual. Jesus didn't reject that ceremonial water. He transformed it. He took the old form and gave it new content. When life doesn't work out the way we anticipate or the way that we think it should, we don't have to leave it alone and accept that this world, this life is a chaotic mess. John's story of this miracle makes this one of the most memorable weddings in history. It's a manifestation of God's power and a glimpse of the visible radiance of God in Jesus Christ. In Dostoevsky's novel, when Alyosha dreamt of being at the wedding and saw Father Zosima, he had an epiphany. He was able to truly and suddenly understand what God was doing. He was able to see and experience God's love. He could now, for the story, accept that Father Zosima had passed away and was no longer physically present, but he also could move into a season of redemption. Dostoevsky, later, when he reflected on this novel, this massive tome, said this chapter, Cana of Galilee, was the most important one in the whole book. So what about us? What do we do? Are we able to accept God's presence? Are we able to accept God's transforming love in our lives? Are we able to see God moving? Or are we a little bit like Alyosha when he first went into the dream and was on the sidelines waiting to see what would happen? Do we resist? This morning, when I got up, it was pouring rain. Last Sunday, it was pouring rain and continued raining all morning last Sunday. Last Sunday, I remember vividly when I woke up very early and I heard it raining, I had this deflated, dejected feeling, oh no. No one's going to come to church today. I don't know if it was half dream state, half awake, but I thought, what a good morning to turn off the alarm clock, go back to sleep, and watch on YouTube. Or curl up with a really good book. But then, it was really interesting because here, last Sunday, we we had 30-some visitors from Denmark filling up this whole side of the center section. Was that God interacting with my fear, with my frustration, with my concern? No, because, see, they had planned to come long before last Sunday morning, probably even months ahead of time. As a matter of fact, there may have been no correlation. I'm rather convinced there wasn't, but I thought it was a bit of divine humor. Where I was coming from when I entered the sanctuary and what I saw and what I witnessed. And I thought, yeah, God, you're still moving. You're still doing stuff. You're still rocking my world. Still pushing my faith. Pray for wherever that siren is heading. It may be nothing. It may be a false alarm, but we can be reminded every time we hear one of those sirens pass, whether it's during our worship service or past our car on the road, that somebody is in dire need of our prayers at that moment. We don't get to see all the layers in our lives. We don't get to see all the layers in the world. If we could lift the veil and see the divine moment, I am convinced we couldn't handle it. We wouldn't be able to. Frederick Buechner writes, "A dream is a compression of time, where the dreamer can live through a whole constellation of events in no more time than it takes the curtain to rustle in the room where the dreamer sleeps. In dreams, time doesn't flow in a linear direction. It bubbles up like a spring. And in this way, every wedding is a dream. And every word that is spoken there means more than it says. And every gesture, the clasping of hands, the giving of rings, is rich with mystery. Part of the mystery is that Christ is there, just as he was at Cana once. And the joy of a wedding, or a new season, or maybe even sometimes the tears of a season of failure, are a miracle that he works. But when the wedding feast is over, Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem and started out for the hour, the time that hadn't yet come, but was to come soon enough. The hour when he, like Dostoevsky's Alyosha, was to embrace the whole earth. And when he did, he watered it not with tears from his eyes, but from so much more. Amen.